graves in the auxiliary section do not have names. They have numbers. 4 digits on a pale stone, flush with the ground. No rank, no branch, no dates. My supervisor told me on orientation that the records for these interments are held in a separate federal system that I do not have clearance to access. I asked him once, early on, what the criteria was. What made someone a numbered grave rather than a named one? He looked at me for a moment in a way I recognized later as the look of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. Then he said the people in this section served in capacities that are still, in some cases, technically classified. I nodded like that was a satisfying answer. It is not a satisfying answer. What is in that ground is not fully known to me, and I have worked this section for 11 months. And there is one evening from 4 months ago that I think about every single night before I fall asleep and cannot stop reaching for. The way you reach for something in the dark that you know is there, but cannot quite touch. My name is Eloise Marsh. I am 31 years old. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, in a house with aluminum siding and a driveway that heaved every winter and settled back down in the spring. My father sold insurance. My mother taught 4th grade for 22 years and then retired and immediately started substitute teaching because she did not know what else to do with herself. Nobody in my family served. Nobody in my family had any particular relationship to the military, to cemeteries, or to the federal government beyond paying taxes and renewing their driver's licenses when they had to. I mention this because it matters to how I ended up where I am, which is to say, I ended up here entirely by accident, through a chain of events so ordinary that I'm almost embarrassed to recount them. I moved to the DC area in the spring of 3 years ago for a job in database management at a logistics firm in Rosslyn that folded 8 months later. I needed work. I had a clean record, a current security certification from a previous contract job, and a tolerance for night shifts that most people my age had given up somewhere around 25. The federal contract security position at Arlington National Cemetery came through a staffing agency. The recruiter told me it was straightforward overnight work, mostly perimeter monitoring and incident logging. She did not mention the auxiliary section specifically. I do not think she knew about it. The main cemetery, the part that appears in photographs, the part with the rolling hills and the white stones in their precise rows, and the tomb of the unknown soldier with its guard who does not speak and does not stop. That part has its own dedicated staff, its own protocols, its own long institutional memory. I was not assigned there. I was assigned to the auxiliary section, which sits on a separate parcel approximately a quarter-mile east of the main grounds, connected by a service road that passes through a tree line dense enough that you lose sight of both places while you are walking between them. The auxiliary section does not appear on the public maps. It has no visitors, no ceremonies that I have witnessed, no flowers left at the stones. It has 214 graves in the ground, and a small gatehouse at the entrance with a space heater that works intermittently and a coffee maker that works reliably, which is the more important of the two. The grounds themselves are flat, which is unusual for that part of Virginia where everything tends to roll. Someone cleared and leveled this parcel deliberately at some expense and planted grass that is maintained by a groundskeeping crew that comes on Thursday mornings before I arrive and leaves before I start my shift, so I've never spoken to any of them. The numbered stones are arranged in 9 rows running east to west, spaced evenly, the same pale granite, the same flush cut, the same 4 digits. Some of the numbers are sequential, some are not. Row 4 jumps from 1847 to 2009, with nothing in between. Jan and I have stood at that gap more than once in the middle of a quiet night and looked at the empty ground between those 2 stones and thought about what that gap means, whether it means anything. Whether the absence of numbers represents absent records or absent remains or something I do not have the framework to categorize. At the far eastern edge of the grounds, just inside the perimeter fence, there is a single oak tree. It has no marker, no designation, no reason I can identify for being there rather than cut down when the land was cleared. It is old enough that the roots have lifted the fence line slightly on one side, creating a gap that I noted in my first week's maintenance report, and that has not been repaired in the 11 months since. I look at that tree every night when I make my eastern pass. It is the oldest living thing in a place full of things that are no longer living. And something about that specific fact has always struck me as either deeply appropriate or deeply wrong, and I have never been able to decide which. The silence here is different from other silences I have known. I have worked night shifts in empty office buildings and hospital corridors and a regional airport between midnight and 5 in the morning. And all of those places have their own quality of quiet. But a place built specifically to hold the permanent stillness of other things, that silence has a texture to it. It is not the absence of sound. It is something more like the presence of a very specific kind of waiting. I noticed it on my first night and told myself I was being fanciful. I notice it on every shift and have stopped telling myself anything about it at all. I make my first perimeter walk at the start of each shift, just after sunset. It takes approximately 22 minutes if I maintain a steady pace and do not stop. In 11 months, I have rarely maintained a steady pace and rarely not stopped. There is always something to look at, something to note, some quality of the light or the ground or the air between the stones that is slightly different from the night before, in a way I cannot always articulate. I log what I can articulate. The rest I carry home with me in the way that night work tends to follow you, quiet and patient, through the drive home and into the apartment and sometimes into the hours before sleep. That feeling, the one I carried home every morning in the early weeks. The one I learned to recognize and have not yet, even now, found the right word for. I want to be honest about it. It was not fear. Fear has a direction to it, a specific object. This was more ambient than that. More like the low hum of a frequency I could not quite identify, present in every corner of the grounds, at every hour of my shift, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply there, the way the tree at the eastern fence was there. Older than my understanding of it, entirely indifferent to whether I understood it at all, I should tell you about Harlan Price. Harlan Price drove a 12-year-old Buick LeSabre, the color of old concrete, and kept a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder that he refilled exactly once per shift from the maker in the gatehouse, and never offered to share. Not out of stinginess, but out of the particular self-containment of a man who had been doing solitary work for a long time and had reorganized his habits accordingly. He was 63, maybe 64. I never asked. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of mild, unsurprised attention, the way certain rocks look after a long time near moving water. He wore the same style of dark uniform jacket every night, with a pen in the breast pocket that he clicked exactly twice before writing anything down. I noticed the clicking before I noticed much else about him, because it happened in the spaces where other people would have cleared their throats or filled silence with something. He met me at the gatehouse on my first night at 9:15, which was 15 minutes after my shift was supposed to start. He did not apologize for being late. He showed me the coffee maker, the space heater controls, the radio mounted on the wall above the desk, the binder of incident report templates on the second shelf. He walked me through the camera feed interface on the desktop monitor, which was old enough that the fan made a sound like a small animal running in place. "Follow the perimeter in sequence," he said, his back to me while he checked the camera feeds. "South gate first, then western fence, northern boundary, eastern fence, back to south. Don't vary it." I asked why the sequence mattered. He clicked his pen twice. Because you need to know what the grounds look like when nothing is wrong, so you know what they look like when something is. It was a reasonable answer. It was also the kind of answer that is technically responsive without being fully responsive. And I had already begun to notice that Harlan Price was precise in that specific way. He told me the sensor reset procedure, the protocol for contacting the main grounds office, the fact that trespassers were uncommon but not unheard of. Mostly people who had followed online cemetery tourism guides that occasionally listed the auxiliary section by mistake. Radio before you approach anyone on foot, he said. Don't go to them directly. I asked if that was standard procedure or something specific to this posting. He looked at me over his shoulder. Both. Then he picked up his thermos, looked at the window that faced the grounds, and said it without any particular change in register, the way you would state a fact about the building that any reasonable new employee ought to know. Never whistle after sunset. Never hum. Never make any rhythmic sound with your mouth once it gets dark out there. I waited for the rest of it. The reason, the context, the origin story that would make it make sense. He clicked his pen twice and wrote the date at the top of the handover log. I said, "What about singing?" He turned and looked at me with those river rock eyes. "That falls under rhythmic sound." I said I had a pretty bad singing voice. I said it with the particular lightness I use when I am in a new situation and trying to establish that I am someone who is not going to be difficult, someone easy to work with, someone who can hold the strangeness of a thing lightly. He did not smile. He capped his pen, set it on the desk, and looked at me in a way that was not unkind, but was entirely serious. The way a person looks at you when they want to make sure the preamble is finished. "I mean it, Eloise." He said my name with a deliberateness that made it feel less like familiarity and more like emphasis. "Not after dark. Not out there." I said, "Okay." He held my eyes for one more second, long enough that I understood the okay needed to be a real one. And then he nodded and moved on to the incident report binder. "I meant it the way you mean. Okay, when you are not sure what you are agreeing to, but you can tell that the person asking is not being theatrical about it." There was no theater in Harlan Price. That was the thing. A theatrical person delivering a strange rule in a strange place would have been easier to dismiss. Harlan delivered it the way he delivered everything else that evening, in the same flat factual register he used to describe the sensor reset procedure. That register was either the most reassuring thing about him or the least reassuring thing about him, and it took me several weeks to decide it was the latter. Before he left that first night, I stopped him at the door. "How long have you worked this section?" I asked. 11 years. "Has that rule always been part of the job?" He pulled his jacket straight with one hand, a small automatic gesture of someone preparing to go outside. "It came from before my time. That's all the provenance I have on it." He paused with his hand on the door frame, not quite turning back. "Just follow the sequence. Log what you see. Keep it quiet out there." The Buick's taillights disappeared down the service road and into the tree line, and I stood at the gatehouse window and watched the darkness close back over the path he had taken. And I thought about the way he had said, "Keep it quiet," the way most people would say goodnight, as if it were simply the natural way to end a conversation in a place like this. I found out about the 2 previous guards the following week. Not from Harlan, but from a woman named Patricia Odom at the staffing agency who called to check on my onboarding and mentioned, in the careful way people mention things they think might be relevant without knowing exactly why, that the position had experienced some turnover recently. I asked her to define recently. She said the last 2 guards before me had both left within their first month. One of them, a man named David Calloway, had simply stopped showing up after his 3rd week and had not returned calls. The other, a woman named Renata Solis, had submitted a written resignation. I asked if she still had the letter. There was a pause that lasted a beat longer than a routine administrative pause. She said she would have to check the files. She never followed up. I did not push it, partly because I had already started to understand that certain questions about the auxiliary section had a way of not quite arriving at answers, and partly because something in Patricia Odom's voice when she said Renata Solis had submitted a written resignation told me that the letter had said something Patricia was not going to repeat to a new employee over the phone. Harlan's detail that stayed with me, the one I turned over during the long, quiet hours of my early shifts, was small enough that I almost did not register it at the time. When he walked me through the perimeter route that first night, he described it in precise sequence: the landmarks, the timing, the specific gravel stretch near the northern boundary where the path narrowed between two rows of stones. He described all of it without hesitation, with the easy fluency of a person reciting something their body knows. But when he got to the eastern fence, to the oak tree at the far edge of the grounds, he stopped 1/2 second longer than he stopped anywhere else in the description. Not long, just a fraction, a single extra beat, the way a person's voice changes almost imperceptibly when they pass over something they have decided not to say. Then he moved on to the south gate and finished the route and said nothing more about it. I have thought about that 1/2 second more times than I can count. Night shift work has a grammar to it that takes about 3 weeks to internalize, and after that becomes as automatic as breathing. You stop fighting the hours. Your body stops expecting daylight at the end of a stretch of wakefulness and starts expecting the particular gray that comes just before dawn. The specific quality of light that means the shift is almost done, and the drive home will be quiet and the apartment will be cool. And you will sleep better than you ever slept at night, because your body has finally stopped arguing with the schedule and accepted it. I internalized the grammar of the auxiliary section somewhere around the end of my 3rd week, right around the time Patricia Odom stopped returning my follow-up calls about Renata Solis. And after that, the job settled into a rhythm that was, in most respects, a genuinely manageable. The shift ran 9 in the evening to 5 in the morning. I arrived early enough to get coffee made before Harlan finished the handover log and left in the Buick. The first perimeter walk happened immediately after he pulled out. While the ground still held whatever thin warmth the October afternoons had managed to put into the soil. South gate, western fence, northern boundary, eastern fence, back to south. 22 minutes at a steady pace, longer if I stopped, which I usually did at least twice. Once at the gap in row 4 between stones 1847 and 2009. And once at the oak tree on the eastern fence line, where I would stand for a moment and look at the way the roots had lifted the fence and think about maintenance reports that nobody acted on, and the specific patience of things that grow slowly and do not require anyone's permission. After the first walk, I came back to the gatehouse and logged the observation, which was almost always the same. Grounds clear, sensors nominal, no activity. Then I made a second coffee, ate whatever I had packed, and worked through the administrative portion of the shift, which consisted mostly of checking the sensor logs, updating the maintenance flag list that nobody appeared to read, and occasionally cross-referencing the camera timestamps against my perimeter notes to make sure the motion logs were capturing what they should. Around 1 in the morning, I did a second walk, shorter, just the inner rows. Around 3, I did a final check of the gatehouse systems and wrote up the handover notes for whoever came in the morning, which was a rotating day guard named Phil Acosta, who left his empty coffee cups on the desk and was otherwise entirely inoffensive. That was the rhythm. It was not unpleasant. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what comes later. I was not miserable out there. I was not counting days or dreading shifts. The grounds had a quality of stillness that I had learned to inhabit rather than resist. And there is something to be said for work that asks you to pay attention to a specific place over a long stretch of time. because the place begins to reveal itself in small ways, the way any subject does when you study it with patience and without agenda. Which is how I noticed the three things, not because I was looking for them, because I was paying attention. The first happened on a Wednesday, in the second week of August. I was on my 1 a.m. walk, inner rows only, when sensor 12, which covers the northeastern quadrant of row 6, activated. I checked the handheld monitor. The camera feed for that zone showed nothing. No movement, no figure, no animal, no disturbance of any visible kind. I walked the row myself with my flashlight and found the stones exactly as they always were. The grass between them undisturbed, the ground unbroken. I noted it in my log. Sensor 12, activation without identifiable cause, 1:14 a.m., no physical evidence of triggering event. I submitted it as a maintenance flag. Phil Acosta wrote faulty sensor hardware needs replacement on a sticky note and put it on the binder. The sensor was not replaced. It did not activate again for 6 weeks. I noted that too. The second thing happened on a Friday in early September, on the northern boundary stretch where the path runs closest to the fence and farthest from the tree line. There was a wind that night, coming from the northwest, steady enough that I could feel it on the left side of my face during the western fence portion of the walk. When I turned north and then east, the wind should have moved to my back and then to my right side in sequence. Instead, on the eastern half of the northern boundary, I walked into a cold that was coming from the ground rather than the air, moving against the wind direction entirely, pooling around my ankles and shins the way cold water pools at the bottom of a slope. It lasted approximately 40 feet of walking and then was gone. The temperature on my handheld weather app read 51 degrees for the duration. I noted it as a ground-level thermal anomaly, possible drainage or soil composition factor. I believed that explanation for about 2 days before I stopped believing it and stopped trying to replace it with anything else. The third thing happened on a Tuesday in late September, on the first perimeter walk, near the midpoint of the eastern fence. I was passing row 5, stones 2,198 through 2,241, when I became completely certain that something was breathing directly behind me. Not at a distance. Close. The specific closeness of another person walking a step behind you in a narrow space. I turned around in one motion, flashlight up. Nothing. The row was empty. The grass was still. The nearest stone, 2,241, caught the edge of my flashlight beam and threw it back pale and flat, the way pale granite does, without warmth, without depth. I stood there for a moment. My own breathing was the only sound. I noted it as a possible auditory disturbance, origin unconfirmed. Possible wind effect through the fence line. I wrote it down at 9:47 p.m. on September 23rd in the small notebook I had started keeping separately from the official log, because I had begun to understand that the official log was for things that had explanations, and I had begun to accumulate things that did not. When I look at those 3 dates now, August 14th, September 5th, September 23rd, I see the intervals between them. 19 days, 18 days. Narrowing. I did not see it then. I was tired, and the job was routine. And I had learned to hold the unexplained things lightly the way Harlan's manner had implicitly instructed me to. And the nights were getting shorter and colder, and the oak tree on the eastern fence had started dropping leaves that caught in the lifted fence gap and gathered there in a dry, specific pile that I noted and did not report because it was a tree doing what trees do in October, and some things do not require documentation. On the Tuesday of the 4th week of October, a man named Marcus Webb, who worked the secondary overnight rotation and covered my days off, called in sick for the second consecutive week. I had not met Marcus Webb in person. I knew him only from his handover notes, which were brief and tidy, and suggested someone who paid attention, And from the fact that his absence meant I was working a double shift, 9 in the evening straight through to 5 the following evening, on 4 hours of sleep and the particular frayed quality of attention that comes from too many consecutive nights in a place that requires you to notice things. I want to be precise about my state of mind that evening. I was not frightened. I was not on edge. I was tired in the specific, manageable way of someone who has learned their job and trusts their own competence and has simply not slept enough. I was, in the way that tired people sometimes are, not fully monitoring myself. That is the only explanation I have for what happened 40 minutes into my first perimeter walk. I was thinking about my electric bill. I want to be specific about that because it matters to me that you understand how ordinary the moment was. Not the culmination of 3 months of accumulated dread. Not a night when I had arrived at the grounds already primed for something. I was walking the eastern fence on a Tuesday in October at 9:47 in the evening, and I was thinking about whether I had remembered to set up the automatic payment on my new checking account. And the air smelled like cold soil and the faint mineral edge that comes off the Potomac when the temperature drops, and my boots made their usual sound on the gravel path. And I was approximately 8 feet from stone 2241 when I did it. 3 notes. I could not tell you the pitches with any precision, not then. I was not thinking in pitches. I was not thinking about sound at all. It was the kind of thing a mouth does when a body is tired and moving through a familiar space, and the conscious mind has drifted sideways into electric bills and automatic payments. Air pressure released through pursed lips in a brief 3-beat shape. Not a tune I recognized, not the opening of anything. Just 3 notes, ascending slightly, lasting perhaps 2 seconds total. And then I closed my mouth and kept walking. I had taken exactly 2 more steps before the handheld monitor on my belt began vibrating. I stopped. The monitor vibrated continuously when multiple sensors activated simultaneously, a setting I had configured in my second week because the default alert sound was loud enough to carry across the grounds, and I had decided early on that I preferred silence to notification sounds in a place like this. I unclipped it and looked at the screen. The sensor status display showed all active indicators lit. Not most of them. Not a spreading pattern moving outward from my position the way a disturbance caused by something physical would produce. All 47, every zone, every quadrant. The full grid illuminated at once in the flat green of the status display, the timestamp reading 21:47:03. I stood completely still. The camera feed interface required me to load each zone separately, which I had complained about in a maintenance note in my 3rd week and which I now understood. You in the specific clarity that comes with the particular kind of fear that does not announce itself as fear, but simply makes everything very slow and very precise, was going to require me to look at what each camera showed, 1 screen at a time. I loaded feed 1, South Gate, exterior view. The gate was closed, the path empty, the gravel undisturbed. But at the edge of the frame, at the border of the camera's range where the image degraded into grain, there was a shape beside stone 0112, upright, still. The resolution at that distance was not sufficient to show detail. I could see that it was approximately the height and proportion of a standing person. I could see that it was not moving. I could see that it was oriented toward the eastern fence, toward where I was standing. I loaded feed 2, western fence, row 3, a shape beside stone 1204, same height, same stillness, same orientation. I loaded feed 3, northern boundary, row 7, a shape beside stone 2089. I want to tell you that I stopped loading feeds at some point, that the weight of it became too much and I put the monitor away and called Harlan or called the main office or called anyone at all. I did not stop. I loaded all 12 feeds. I stood on the gravel path 8 feet from stone 2241 in the October dark, and I looked at every single one. They were not identical. That was the first thing I understood. And it was the thing that moved the experience from frightening into something that does not have a word I have found yet. On the feeds with sufficient resolution, I could see that the figures were dressed differently. Feed 4 showed something in what appeared to be a military uniform, with a silhouette I associated with mid-20th century cut, the particular shape of a service jacket with its squared shoulders. Feed 7 showed a figure in what looked like civilian clothing, a coat of some kind, the proportions suggesting a woman or a slight man. Feed 9, covering row 4, the row with the gap between 1847 and 2009, showed 2 figures rather than one, standing close together beside a stone near the gap. And one of them was small, significantly small, the size of a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing very straight, oriented with the same absolute attention as every other figure on every other feed. I did not make a sound. I was not making a decision about silence. Silence was simply the only thing available to me in that moment. The way stillness is the only thing available when you realize the ground you are standing on is less stable than you believed, and any movement might change the nature of what is happening. They were all facing east, all 47 of them, or however many figures corresponded to however many stones. All oriented toward the eastern fence, toward the oak tree and the lifted ground, and the gravel path where I was standing with my handheld monitor and my 4 hours of sleep and my completely ordinary thoughts about an automatic payment I may or may not have set up correctly. They were facing me. I checked my watch at some point in that stillness, I cannot tell you exactly when, and noted the time as 21:49. I checked it again when something changed, and it read 22:11. 22 minutes. I stood on that path for 22 minutes in a silence so complete that I could hear the Potomac wind moving through the oak tree behind me. And I did not move, and they did not move. And the monitor in my hand showed 12 feeds of figures standing at attention beside numbered stones in the dark. And I thought about Harlan Price saying, "I mean it, Eloise." And I thought about the half-second pause at the eastern fence when he described the perimeter route. And I thought about Renata Solis's written resignation that Patricia Odom would not characterize over the phone. And I thought about the gap between stones 1847 and 2009 in row 4, and the 2 figures standing together near it, one of them the size of a child. At 22:11, the figure beside stone 0112, the oldest numbered stone in the Southgate zone, was no longer there, and I watched feed 1 for a moment to confirm what I had seen or not seen, and then I checked the others in sequence. Feed 2, the shape beside stone 1204 was gone. Feed 3, gone. I moved through the feeds in the order I had loaded them, which happened to correspond roughly to the chronological order of the numbered stones, oldest sections first, and that was how I understood the sequence. They were leaving in order, beginning with the lowest numbers, the oldest interments, moving forward through the rows, chronologically, the way you might move through a record from the first entry to the last. By 22:14, all 12 feeds showed empty ground. I stood on the path for another few minutes without checking the monitor. The sensor grid had gone dark at 22:11, the same moment the first figure disappeared and had not reactivated. The grounds were silent. The oak tree moved in the wind. Stone 2241 stood 8 feet from my left boot, pale and flush and exactly as it had always been. And I looked at it for a long time before I clipped the monitor back to my belt and finished the eastern fence portion of the route and walked back to the gatehouse. I made a third coffee. I sat down at the desk. I completed the shift. She called at 4:13 in the afternoon. I was still at the kitchen table with a second pot of coffee and my notebook opened to the page where I had written the 3 dates: August 14th, September 5th, September 23rd, and drawn a line under them without knowing exactly why. The phone rang once, and I picked it up, and a voice said, "Ms. Marsh, this is Constance Ewan, and I want you to know before we begin that I am not going to think you are making this up." I said I appreciated that. She said, "I also want to be clear that I am a researcher. What I am going to tell you reflects what is documented across multiple cultural traditions and what I can support with evidence. I am not going to tell you what it means in any absolute sense. I want us to be precise with each other." I said that was exactly what I wanted. "Good," she said. "And then tell me about the site first. Not what happened. The site itself." Her voice was measured and quick, the voice of someone who thought faster than she spoke and had learned to compensate by being very deliberate about word choice. I had expected someone older. I do not know why. She sounded like she was in her late 30s, maybe 40. I could hear what sounded like a university office in the background, the specific acoustic of high ceilings and hard floors, and a window that faced something with traffic. I told her about the auxiliary section, the numbered stones, the classified designation, the separate record system I did not have access to, the 9 rows running east to west, the gap in row 4 between 1847 and 2009. I told her about the oak tree on the eastern fence. I told her about the 3 dates and the narrowing intervals and the way the silence in the grounds had a texture that I had never found the right word for. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "The gap in row 4. You said it jumps from 1847 to 2009. "Yes. And you have noted this gap since your first weeks on the posting." I said I had stood at it more than once. "That gap is not empty ground," she said. "It is almost certainly not empty ground." Numbers in classified interment systems of that era were not always sequential by date of interment. They were sometimes sequential by program designation. A gap of that size between 2 active stones suggests either a program that was declassified and its records moved to the name section, which does happen, or a program whose records were not transferred anywhere, because the program itself was of a category that resists transfer. She paused. "I will come back to that." She asked me then to describe the signal, not to reproduce it yet, just to describe it in whatever terms felt accurate. I told her it was 3 notes, ascending, the last note slightly longer than the first 2. I told her it lasted approximately 2 seconds. I told her it was not a tune I recognized and had no conscious origin that I could identify, that it was the kind of sound a tired mouth makes without instruction from the mind that owns it. She said, "Ascending. All 3 ascending, or 2, and then a step down at the end." I thought about it. 2 ascending and then a slight drop on the 3rd, not back to the starting pitch, somewhere in the middle. A brief silence on her end. Then, "Can you reproduce it for me now? Exactly as it was, as closely as you can." I looked at my kitchen window. The afternoon light was flat and gray, and the recycling bins were still on the curb, and everything outside was entirely normal. I pursed my lips and produced the 3 notes into the phone, quietly, the way you do something in your own kitchen that you are slightly embarrassed to be doing. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Ms. Marsh," she said finally. I said yes. That interval is documented in 7 of the 11 traditions I examined in my 2019 paper. It appears in 3 West African burial traditions, 2 Southeast Asian ceremonial contexts, and 2 distinct indigenous North American frameworks that developed entirely independently of each other and of the African and Asian traditions. In each of those 7 traditions, that specific pattern, 2 ascending notes with a medial resolution on the 3rd, is the primary form of what I call the summons interval. It is the sound that opens address between the living and the dead at a site of interment. In the belief structures of all 7 traditions, it is not merely a signal. It is an obligation. The dead are required to answer it. I said I understood that was the documented belief. I asked if she had any documented accounts of the signal being produced accidentally. She said, more than you would expect. And in every case I have on record, the response was consistent with what you described. Presence, orientation, a structured withdrawal. I asked her what the withdrawal meant in the traditions she had studied. She said that varied. In some traditions, it indicated that the summons had been heard and acknowledged, but that the summoner lacked the authority to complete the address, so the dead returned to waiting. In others, it indicated that the summoner had produced the opening interval, but not the closing one, and the dead were waiting for the address to be completed before they could respond fully. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked what the closing interval was. She said she did not know. That was the honest answer. The closing interval, in the traditions where it was documented at all, was held by specific ritual authorities and was not recorded in any source she had access to. She said there was one exception, a classified program that she had encountered as a footnote in 3 separate archival sources, all dating from the early 1980s, that appeared to have involved the deliberate use of acoustic protocols at classified interment sites. The program had a designation she had never been able to fully decode. It had terminated in 1987. She did not know why it terminated or what it had been trying to accomplish. I asked if she knew anything else about it. She said, I know the name of the Army chaplain who served the interments associated with that program from 1979 to its termination. He is retired. He lives in Fredericksburg, Virginia. His name is Father Edmund Osei, and I have been trying to reach him for 2 years. I wrote the name in my notebook under the 3 dates and the line I had drawn beneath them. I asked if he had responded to her. He has not responded to me, she said. And there was something careful in her voice when she said it. The specific carefulness of someone who has decided that the reason a thing has not happened is not their business to speculate about out loud. But I am not a security guard at a federal cemetery who has accidentally produced a primary summons interval at a classified interment site. I think his calculus about whether to talk might be different with you. I said I would go to Fredericksburg. She said, Ms. Marsh, one more thing. I waited. Until you understand what you said and what the complete address consists of, she said, I would strongly recommend against producing those 3 notes again. In any of the traditions I have documented, an incomplete summons that is repeated without resolution is understood to constitute something closer to a demand than an invitation. And the dead, in every framework I have studied, respond to demands differently than they respond to invitations. I said I understood. I haven't whistled since. I drove home at 5:15 in the morning on the George Washington Parkway, with the Potomac on my left going dark and flat, under a sky that had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. The heater in my car made a sound like someone breathing through their nose in a quiet room. I had the radio off. I was not ready for other people's voices yet. Not even voices coming out of a speaker talking about traffic and weather and the ordinary texture of a world that did not contain what I had just seen on 12 camera feeds in a federal cemetery at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I want to tell you why I did not call it in. It is not a complicated reason, but it is a specific one. And it says something true about me that I would rather you understand than gloss over. I did not call it in because I could not construct a report that would survive contact with anyone who had not been standing on that gravel path. I am not someone who struggles to articulate things. I have always been precise, sometimes to a fault. The kind of person who reads instruction manuals and checks citations and does not forward things without verifying them first. What I had seen on those feeds was real. I was certain of that with the same certainty I was certain of my own name. But certainty is not the same as evidence that translates. Figures of indeterminate resolution standing beside graves on 12 camera feeds could be anything. Shadows, artifacts, lens distortion on old equipment with a fan that sounded like a running animal. Any competent person reviewing the footage without the context of the sensor activation, without the simultaneity, without the child-sized figure in feed 9 standing very straight in the dark, could construct a reasonable alternative explanation in under 2 minutes and file the incident as equipment malfunction and move on. And then they would review my logs. They would find the sensor activation in August, the thermal anomaly in September, the auditory disturbance on September 23rd near Stone 2241. They would find a pattern of unusual incident reports from a guard who had been on the posting for 3 months. And the most available interpretation of that pattern was not that something genuine was happening in the auxiliary section, but that the auxiliary section had claimed another guard the way it had apparently claimed David Calloway and Renata Solis, quietly and completely, and that Eloise Marsh was next. I was not going to be next. I was going to figure out what I had said. I parked outside my apartment building in Alexandria at 5:45 and went upstairs and made a pot of coffee I did not need and opened my laptop on the kitchen table. I started where any reasonable person starts, which is not with the paranormal or the folkloric, but with the documented and the verifiable. Classified military interments in the United States. It is not a secret that such a thing exists. It is documented in congressional records, in declassified FOIA requests, in academic papers that treat the subject with the careful neutrality of people writing about things that are politically sensitive rather than things that are frightening. I found references to numerical designation systems used for remains during and after the Korean War, specifically for operatives whose official non-existence needed to be maintained, even in death. I found a 1987 Senate subcommittee report that referenced auxiliary interment facilities at 3 national cemetery sites without naming them. I found a footnote in a 2014 dissertation from American University that mentioned a chaplaincy directive from 1981 recommending modified burial rites for certain classified interments without specifying what the modification involved or why it had been considered necessary. That footnote sent me sideways through 4 more sources before I arrived, at 7:30 in the morning on a Wednesday in October, at a paper published in the Georgetown Journal of Cultural Studies in 2019. The author was a researcher named Dr. Constance Ewan, and he listed as Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology and Mortuary Tradition. The paper was titled Acoustic Summons, Whistled Signal Traditions in Military and Ceremonial Burial Practice Across 11 Cultural Contexts. I read the abstract twice. Then I read the full paper, which was 31 pages, in just over an hour, with my coffee going cold beside me and the Alexandria morning starting up outside my window in its ordinary way, traffic and dogs and someone's recycling bins being rolled to the curb. Dr. Ewan's argument was methodical and specific. In 11 documented cultural traditions, spanning West Africa, Southeast Asia, the Andes, and 3 distinct indigenous North American contexts, a whistled signal of 3 notes functioned as what she called an acoustic threshold marker, a sound used at burial sites to indicate to the dead that they were being formally addressed by the living. The traditions had developed independently of each other. The intervals varied, but the structure was consistent across all 11. 3 notes, a specific ascending or descending pattern, used only at the site of interment, used only by someone with recognized authority to speak to the dead, and understood within each tradition to constitute an invitation that carried obligation. The dead, in each of these frameworks, were understood to be required to respond. I sat with that for a moment. Then I wrote her an email. I kept it brief because I did not know how much of the truth would make me sound credible versus how much would make me sound like someone who should not be working night shifts alone. The email said, "Dr. Ewan, my name is Eloise Marsh. I work as a security guard at a federal cemetery in Virginia. I am writing because I read your 2019 paper on acoustic summons traditions, and I believe I may have accidentally produced a 3-note whistled signal at a classified interment site. I would like to understand what such a signal typically means in the traditions you documented. Specifically, whether the number of notes carries distinct meaning, and whether there are any documented accounts of unintentional activation of this kind of signal. I apologize if this is outside the scope of questions you normally receive." I sent it at 8:14 in the morning. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed and slept for 6 hours, which was longer than I expected and shorter than I needed. When I woke at 2:17 in the afternoon and opened the laptop, there was a reply. It was 4 sentences long. The first 2 confirmed that she had received my email and that my question was, in her words, not outside the scope of questions she received, which told me something I was not sure I wanted to know about the kind of correspondence a researcher in this specific field apparently considered routine. The third sentence said she would very much like to speak with me directly if I was willing. The fourth sentence said, "Before we speak, can you tell me how many notes? Not can you tell me what you heard, or can you describe the sound, or are you certain it was a whistle and not something else? How many notes?" As if the number were the first and most essential piece of information, the variable on which everything else depended, under the detail that would tell her something specific before she said another word. I closed the laptop and looked at the ceiling of my Alexandria apartment for a while. The recycling bins were still on the curb outside. Someone's dog was still barking 2 streets over. The afternoon was entirely ordinary in every direction except the one I was facing. I typed back, 3. Her response came in under 4 minutes. It said, "I think we should talk today." Father Edmund Osei lived in a narrow 2-story house on a street of similar houses in a quiet part of Fredericksburg, where the lots were small and the trees were large, and the Saturday afternoon had the specific stillness of a neighborhood, where most of the residents were older and kept their own hours. I parked on the street at 2:17 and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house. There was a small garden along the front path that had been put to bed for winter, with a deliberateness that suggested someone who took the garden seriously. The perennials cut back cleanly, the beds mulched in even lines. A wind chime made of what appeared to be small bronze discs hung from the porch eave and moved without sound in the October air, which I noticed because wind chimes generally make sound and this one did not. And I filed that detail in the part of my mind that had become, over the past 4 days, increasingly attentive to things that were quiet when they should not have been. He opened the door before I reached it. He was shorter than I had imagined, which was my own failure of imagination since I had no real basis for imagining him at all. 80, perhaps older, with close-cropped white hair and dark skin that had the particular quality of old photographs, rich and deep and somehow more present than the surroundings. He wore a dark cardigan over a collared shirt and stood very straight in the doorway, with both hands visible at his sides in the posture of a man who had spent decades being deliberate about not startling people. His eyes were clear and specific and moved over me once with the efficiency of someone who had spent a long time reading rooms and people quickly. "You are the guard," he said. It was not a question. I said I was. He stepped back from the door. "Come in. I have already made tea." The inside of the house smelled like tea and old paper and something faintly resinous that I associated with churches, though there was nothing overtly religious in the front room beyond a small wooden cross above the doorway to the hall and a photograph on the side table of a younger Osei in Army chaplain's dress uniform standing with 3 other men in front of a building I did not recognize. He led me to a sitting room at the back of the house with 2 chairs and a low table and a window overlooking the winter garden. A tray with a teapot and 2 cups was already on the table. He poured without asking how I took it and sat down across from me and folded his hands in his lap and looked at me with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a specific amount of time and had made peace with the waiting. I said, "Dr. Yuen gave me your name." He nodded. "Constance has been thorough." I did not respond to her letters because what she was looking for was academic context. He paused. "What you are looking for is different." I asked him how he knew what I was looking for. He picked up his tea. "Because you are the guard at the auxiliary section and you are here on a Saturday afternoon instead of sleeping before your shift. Which means something has happened that the academic context alone will not explain." He looked at me over the rim of the cup. "Tell me what you heard when it happened. Not what you saw, what you heard." I told him about the 3 notes, the ascending pattern, the medial resolution, the 2 seconds of sound I had produced without intention near stone 2241 on a Tuesday night in October. I told him it quietly, the way you tell someone something that you have not yet said out loud to another person who was actually present, which has its own specific quality of vulnerability. He set his cup down carefully on the tray and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That interval was not random." "I know that now," I said. Dr. Yuen explained the summons traditions. I asked him if he knew why that specific interval appeared at the auxiliary section, what the connection was between the numbered graves and an acoustic protocol documented across 7 independent burial traditions on 4 continents. He looked at the winter garden through the window. His hands were still folded in his lap with the same deliberate stillness as when I had arrived. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed, a slight settling. The way a person's posture changes when they reach the part of a story they have been carrying for a long time and have finally arrived at the moment of setting it down. "The program," he said, "began in 1973. It had a designation I am not going to repeat, because I gave a commitment about that which I have kept for 40 years and intend to keep until I am in the ground myself. What I can tell you is its nature. As certain people who worked for this government in capacities that could never be officially acknowledged were dying in the field, in Southeast Asia primarily, and their remains were being recovered and interred in auxiliary sections of national cemeteries under numerical designation. No names, no records in any accessible system, no ceremonies of any kind that would draw attention to the existence of people who were required, even in death, to not officially exist." I asked who these people were. He picked up his tea again, held it without drinking. Operatives, assets, local nationals who had worked with American intelligence and could not be repatriated safely, civilians who had provided support in various capacities. He paused for a long moment. "And some children," I said, "the figure in feed 9, the small one." He looked at me directly. Children were used as couriers and intelligence assets in certain operations in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam from the late 1960s through the early 1980s. When they died in the course of those operations, their remains were handled through the same system as the adults. Numerical designation, auxiliary interment, no official record. They were between 7 and 14 years old in most of the cases I was aware of. I performed last rites for 3 of them personally. He said it in the same level voice he had used for everything else. And that levelness was itself the most grief-filled thing I had heard in a long time. The voice of a man who had processed something devastating so many times over so many years that the affect had worn smooth, the way a stone wears smooth in moving water. And what remained was not absence of feeling, but the distilled residue of feeling that has nowhere left to go. I said I was sorry. He nodded once. In 1981, he said, a chaplain at one of the other auxiliary sites, not Arlington, a site in Maryland that no longer exists, submitted a memo to the program's oversight committee. He had been performing last rites at a night interment, and afterward, standing alone at the grave, had heard something rising from the ground. He described it as structured, almost musical, a pattern of sound that repeated 3 times and then stopped. He was a careful man, and he wrote it down carefully, and he recommended in the memo that no rhythmic sound be made near those graves after dark. He believed, and he wrote this explicitly, that the people in that ground were in a state of active waiting, that they had not completed whatever passage the dead are supposed to complete, that something about the nature of their deaths and the nature of their interments had left them present in a way that the living should be careful around. I asked if Father Osei had seen the memo himself. Once, he said, in 1983. It was shown to me by the program's liaison officer as part of a briefing about protocol modifications. I read it once, and it was taken back, and I never saw it again. But I remembered it. He looked at the garden. I have thought about it most days since. I asked him what he believed those people were waiting for. He was quiet for long enough that the wind chime on the porch moved again in the silence, its bronze discs touching without sound. Then he said, "I believe they are waiting to be properly addressed, to be spoken to by someone with the standing to complete what was started at their burials, which was nothing, because their burials had no rites of any real kind. I believe your 3 notes were the closest anyone has come in 40 years to beginning that address. And I believe." He looked at me with those clear, specific eyes. That stone 2241 is significant. That the figure that remained oriented toward you longest, if I am reading what you have described correctly, is waiting for something more specific than the others. I asked him why. He said, "Because 2241 is the last number in the sequence, the most recent interment. And the most recent interment in that program was a child, a girl, 11 years old. She died in Laos in 1981, 2 months after the chaplain submitted his memo. I performed her last rites myself. I have never stopped thinking about whether they were sufficient." He folded his hands again with a precision that looked like the physical form of a decision. I do not believe they were. I drove back toward Arlington in the last light of the afternoon with Father Osei's tea still warm in my memory, and his last sentence sitting in the center of my chest where it had settled during the drive and showed no intention of moving. I had a shift in 3 hours. I had been thinking about one thing since I pulled away from his street, past the silent wind chime and the carefully mulched garden beds and the small bronze cross above his front door. One thing that Dr. Ewan had said on the phone the day before in her careful researcher's voice. The dead respond to demands differently than they respond to invitations. I was not planning to make a demand. The shift started at 9. Harlan did the handover in 12 minutes, which was faster than usual. And I wondered afterward whether he had looked at my face and read something in it that made him want to finish quickly and get back to the Buick and the thermos and the service road through the tree line. He clicked his pen twice over the log and said the northern boundary sensor had been running slow on the reset cycle, and to give it an extra 30 seconds before logging a fault. He said it the way he said everything, flat and factual and complete. Then he put his pen in his breast pocket and picked up his thermos and paused at the door with his hand on the frame in the same way he had paused on my first night, the pause I had spent 3 months thinking about. "Everything quiet out there tonight," I said. He looked at the window that faced the grounds. "So far," he said. He said it the way you say "so far" when you mean something more specific than the words contain. Then he left. I watched the Buick's taillights disappear into the tree line and drank half my coffee and checked the sensor grid and wrote the date at the top of the observation log. November 4th. The temperature on the weather app read 38 degrees, with a wind from the northwest at 6 miles per hour. The oak tree on the eastern fence would be bare by now, the last of the leaves gone, the branches making their winter shapes against whatever sky was left after dark. I had checked before my shift, and there was no moon worth mentioning. I started the first perimeter walk at 9:20. South gate, western fence, northern boundary. The gravel on the northern stretch was frozen at the surface, the kind of freeze that makes a faint crackling under your boots that you feel more than hear. The stones in rows 7 and 8 caught my flashlight and threw it back in the same pale, flat way they always did, and I noted the sensor at the northern boundary taking its extra 30 seconds on the reset, and logged it as Harlan had instructed and kept walking. I want to be precise about what I had decided to do and what I had decided not to do. I had decided to walk the eastern fence at normal pace and to stop at the chronological midpoint of the numbered graves, which I had calculated from the stone numbers to fall somewhere in row 5, between markers 2,150 and 2,180. I had decided to stand there for as long as felt right and to pay attention to whatever there was to pay attention to. I had decided not to whistle, not to hum, not to produce any rhythmic sound of any kind. I was not going to complete an address I did not know how to complete. I was not going to make a demand. I was simply going to be present in a specific place, with full knowledge of what that place contained, and with the deliberate intention of paying attention rather than looking away. That was all I had decided. I want to be honest about the fact that it felt like enough. The eastern fence came up at 9:41. I turned south along the fence line and slowed my pace and let the flashlight drop to a lower angle so it was illuminating the ground rather than the stones, because I did not want the light to be the thing I was paying attention to. I wanted to pay attention to the air and the silence and whatever quality the grounds had tonight that was different from or the same as every other night I had walked this path. The cold here was the same ground-level cold I had noted on September 5th. Not the ambient 38 degrees of the weather app, but something lower and more specific, pooling around my boots and shins, moving slightly against the northwest wind in the way that cold water moves against a current when it is flowing from a source rather than settling from above. I noted it and kept walking. Row 6, row 5. I slowed further. The silence changed somewhere between stones 2,150 and 2,160. I do not have more precise language for it than that. And I have tried, because I am a person who values precise language and reaches for it in most circumstances. But the silence between those two stones had a different texture than the silence I had walked through for the previous 20 minutes. Denser somehow, more occupied. The way a room feels different when it contains sleeping people than when it is simply empty. Not threatening, not cold in the way fear is cold, just present, full of something I could not see and was not going to try to see. I stopped at stone 2,171 and turned off the flashlight. The dark was complete for the first 10 seconds while my eyes adjusted. And in that darkness, I became aware of something that I can only describe the way Eloise Marsh describes things, which is carefully and with full acknowledgement that the description is approximate. It was attention. That is the closest word. The specific quality of being attended to by something that has been waiting a long time and has just registered your arrival. Not hostile, not welcoming in any warm sense, simply oriented. The way a room of people all turn to face a door at the same moment before the person on the other side has opened it. That precise, unanimous quality of directed awareness. It was coming from the grounds around me in every direction. But it was concentrated, most dense, most specific, from the direction of stone 2,241 at the end of row 5, 30 feet to my south. I stood still. I breathed through my nose in slow, even intervals, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. The attention did not waver. It held with a patience that was different from the patience of living things, which always contained some small movement, some micro-adjustment, some evidence of the biological work of waiting. This patience was absolute and structural, the patience of something that has been in one position for a very long time and has no competing demands on its attention whatsoever. 4 minutes, maybe slightly more, I stood in it. I let it be what it was. I did not reach for an explanation or a category or a reasonable alternative interpretation. I stood in 38-degree air in a federal cemetery in Virginia in the dark, and I let 47 classified graves and whatever remained present in them attend to me with their full and patient and ancient regard. Then it withdrew. Not suddenly. The way a tide goes out, the way Father Osei's voice had carried grief, gradually and completely, leaving the ground exactly as it had been, the cold pooling around my boots, the northwest wind against the right side of my face, the pale shapes of the stones catching nothing because I had turned my flashlight off and there was nothing to catch. Stone 2241 stood 30 feet to my south in the dark and was simply a stone, and the ground around it was simply ground, and the silence was the ordinary silence of a place built for permanent stillness and not the other kind. I turned the flashlight back on. I finished the eastern fence portion of the route. I walked back to the south gate and noted the time as 10:04 in the observation log and poured the second half of my coffee and sat down at the desk. My hands were steady. I noted that specifically, the way I note things in the auxiliary section, as a data point, as a piece of information about my own state that seemed worth recording. And then I became aware of something else, something interior, not external, not coming from the grounds, but from somewhere in my own chest or my own throat, or the part of the mind that holds sounds before the mouth produces them. The 3 notes were there, not as a memory, not as the faint echo of something I had done accidentally 5 weeks ago. They were present and fully formed and arranged in the specific ascending pattern with the medial resolution. And they had been waiting there in that interior space with the same patient, absolute quality as the attention I had just stood inside. And they had decided, in the moment the attention withdrew, to make themselves known. I sat at the desk with my coffee, and I did not produce them. But I knew, sitting there in the gatehouse with the old monitor fan running its small animal sound and the space heater clicking on and off in the corner, that the question was no longer whether I had accidentally said something to the dead in the auxiliary section of a federal cemetery on a Tuesday night in October. The question was whether I was going to finish what I had started. I am still working the auxiliary section. I want you to know that. I have not resigned the way David Calloway resigned, by simply not returning. I have not submitted a written letter the way Renata Solis did, the one Patricia Odom would not characterize over the phone. I show up at 9, I make my coffee, I walk my perimeter in sequence, south gate to western fence to northern boundary to eastern fence and back. And I log what I can log and carry home what I cannot. And that is the arrangement I have made with the job and with myself and with whatever is in that ground. And it is, for now, sufficient. I have not reported any of this through official channels. The reason is the same reason it was on the morning after the Tuesday in October, is simple and honest and unchanged by everything I've learned since. I have nothing that would survive contact with a reporting structure. What I have is a notebook with 3 dates and a line drawn under them, an email exchange with a researcher at Georgetown, the memory of an elderly chaplain's voice describing the last rites of an 11-year-old girl in Laos in 1981, and 3 notes that live in my chest with the patience of things that have been waiting a long time and have decided they can wait a little longer. I think about the children's-sized figure in Feed 9. I think about it most nights, specifically during the eastern fence portion of the walk, When I pass row 4 and the gap between stones 1847 and 2009. And I think about what Father Osei said about the most recent interment, the last number in the sequence. The girl who was 11 years old and died in a country whose name she may not have chosen to be in, and whose last rites were performed by a man who has spent 40 years not being certain they were sufficient. I think about Father Osei making tea with slow, deliberate hands in his sitting room in Fredericksburg, the winter garden through the window, the silent wind chime on the porch, his folded hands and his level voice, and the specific quality of grief that has worn itself smooth over decades into something that looks, from the outside, almost like calm. I believe they are waiting for something specific, he had said. I believe him. At the start of every shift, before the first perimeter walk, I do one thing that I have done since my second week on the posting, without variation. I stop at the gatehouse window that faces the grounds, and I look at the oak tree on the eastern fence for a moment. The one that has lifted the fence line at its roots and created the gap I reported in my first week's maintenance log, and that has not been repaired in 11 months. I look at it the way you look at something that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave. Something that does not require your understanding in order to continue being exactly what it is. I look at it now with the knowledge that it is the oldest living thing in a place full of things that are not living. And I have finally decided which of the two things that fact is. Not appropriate and not wrong. Both at once, fully, without resolution. The 3 notes are still there when I go to sleep. Present and patient. The way the attention in row 5 was patient, the way the gap in row 4 has been patient, the way Father Osei has been patient for 40 years with a grief that has nowhere left to go and has made its peace with that. I reach for them in the half-second before sleep the way you reach for a word you know. And I do not produce them. And then I am asleep. And in the morning, I drive back along the parkway with the Potomac on my right, going gray and flat in the early light. And I think about what it means to begin something and not yet know how to finish it. I do not have an answer. I am not sure the answer is mine to find alone. But I am still there. Every night, walking the perimeter in sequence, listening to the silence between the stones. And the 3 notes are still waiting. If this story stayed with you, the best thing you can do is subscribe and leave a comment below telling me which detail unsettled you most. The channel grows entirely through people who found something here worth sharing. If you know someone who listens late at night and needs something to think about before sleep, send this to them. New stories arrive every week, each one built to stay with you exactly like this one did.